can hear you, Doctor.
Okay. Did you say yes?
No one responded if they can hear you or not. So.
Okay, so can people hear me? Yes, they must be.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great, thanks.
We can, baby.
Okay, so this is it's going to be a generic presentation about antidepressants or about antidepressants in general. And then next tomorrow, we're going to go into detail in painful ways. But before we get to this slide presentation, I actually found the slide that I was trying to reproduce with pens. By the way, when I close the PowerPoint presentations, the lines that I was drawing, they were behind it, so I don't know how it happened. So that's something strange. So this is the slide about the differential response between patients who respond versus do not respond and placebo. The green line is the placebo response, and the two, the blue and the red, are both treatment responses. These are the patients who responded to the treatment. These are patients who did not respond to treatment. What the drug companies actually present is a summary of these two, and it would go somewhere between the red and the green light, hopefully closer to the red than the green. And that's one reason why placebo response seemed to be so high or the other way, the antidepressant response seems to be so close to the placebo response, because it includes a lot of people who are simply treatment resistant or simply not responding to that medication. But on the red line is the people who did respond to medication. So there's a whole bunch of people who respond to the medication very well. But again, the interesting thing there's lots of patients who respond to the active medication worse than to the placebo. So that's what I was trying to reproduce. And here it is in its actual beauty. Okay. So sometimes the arrows work, sometimes they don't. So the antidepressants. This last year, only the mug was on the slide, but I had to do this. I had to put these two little things that's peeking out behind the mug now: ketamine and Zulresso. This should be Spravato, because that's the FDA-approved version. These are two new medications that I have briefly mentioned. This is the GABAergic, this is the glutaminergic antidepressant. So suddenly, as of this year, the medications that are officially called antidepressants have gained two new, very different members. But what is an antidepressant and what is not an antidepressant? So let's talk about that. One of the reasons why I want to talk about it is because, just one second. Because you're going to see patients who are treating not for depression, let's say treating for anxiety, but you're going to give them an antidepressant. And they say, well, why do you give me an antidepressant for anxiety? Well, it is because these are just names. These are descriptions of medications based on probably the first ever official indication, but they're much, much more than that. So besides treating the different kinds of depression, they also treat anxiety of different forms. They treat OCD, they treat eating disorders, they treat premenstrual or perimenstrual disorders, they treat miscellaneous psychiatric conditions from insomnia to pedophilia, But they also treat non-psychiatric conditions, first and foremost pain, but also all these other kind of non-psychiatric conditions. And anorexia simply means loss of appetite. So let's say in cancer. So it doesn't mean anorexia nervosa. Okay? But also, medications that are not considered antidepressants can be antidepressants, meaning they do have antidepressant effects. These are the different kind of hormones, which we are going to discuss, and this is an established use for these medications. The anti-inflammatories, like this is Celebrex. This would be things like ibuprofen, naltrexone, meloxicam, etc. There's a lot of experimental work going on with this type of medication, but there's a lot of some anecdotal information, including the one that I mentioned. Opiates. Anecdotal. I have seen patients coming to me telling me that I want Suboxone because that's the only thing that works for my depression. And when these people came to us 10 years ago, then they said, well, yeah, sure, you just want to get on high. But no, it became clear that some of the opiates have actually antidepressant effect. That includes buprenorphine. That also includes dextromethadone, which is, methadone is a racemic compound, the left and the right version. The left version is the anti-pain medication, but the right version seem to be having antidepressant effects. So there are studies that are going on right now with dextromethadone for depression. Buprenorphine also, experiments are going on, and there's a medication that's hoping to get on the market for several years now. So far has not. Tramadol, which is a well-known anti-pain medication, an analgesic anti-pain medication, has anecdotal antidepressant effects reported by patients. Benzodiazepines. Alprazolam, which is a friendly Xanax, is actually a benzodiazepine with some antidepressant effect. Nobody would use alprazolam for depression anymore. There's a big push against benzodiazepines nowadays, probably going overboard a little bit. But in the past, when alprazolam was approved, people use it up to 8 milligrams. If you go to the FDA websites or the product insert, you see that it is approved up to 8 milligrams a day. Nobody uses that alprazolam. I have not seen patients over 3 milligrams a day. But again, in the past, you might have seen patients who were taking alprazolam for depression. They used other benzos for depression, but that didn't work out. Alprazolam, in fact, does have some antidepressant effect. And if you ever want to give, ever need to give benzodiazepine for patients with anxiety and depression, then you can pick Xanax. It comes in a slow release form, and it doesn't have the problem with immediate release. It's possible that you heard about it in the anxiety lectures. The so-called antipsychotics, which can be antidepressants, lurasidone, which is Latuda, cariprazine, which is Vraylar. These are established antidepressants, most likely in combination with other medications. And interesting, some of the antibiotics, including minocycline, which is used for chronic skin infections, and D-cycloserine, which is a anti-TB agent. These are both anecdotal and experimental. There are studies that hope to turn D-cycloserine into an antidepressant. My problem is that nobody ever considers that these are still antibiotics, so it may still have all these things that we try to avoid over prescribing antibiotics. Nobody has explained to me ever why is it not a problem, but Be that as it may, some of the antibiotics seem to have antidepressant effects. And finally, iproniazid is one of the first antibiotics, one of the first medications used for treatment of TB, and it is going to be discussed in the next slide, because we're not go turn to the history of antidepressants just for the sake of one slide. The very, very original antidepressant was amphetamine, originally under the name of Benzedrine, now called Adderall and others. It was really the first drug approved for depression in the US. And the mechanism of action was considered to be norepinephrine reuptake inhibition. I'm sure you heard about it in other lectures. This is not to be the case, but it certainly has to do with norepinephrinergic activity. Now, in 1952, this medication, iproniazid, also was abbreviated as INH sometimes, was found to elevate mood trials during clinical trials for tuberculosis. This was the first time the term antidepressant was used, when this medication was found to be working for depression. And this led to the discovery of the MAO inhibitory action. Okay, I'm sorry, this is... Okay, so there was a fairly good pace of discovering new agents. 1957 came the tricyclics. The first one was imipramine, which was a medication derived from chlorpromazine, which was the first antipsychotic medication. Again, norepinephrine reuptake inhibition was first thought to be the antidepressant effect. And only when serotonin reuptake inhibition was discovered in the 1960s, that's when selective agents started to be investigated. And that led to the first clinical use of the first SSRI, which is fluoxetine. It accidentally derived from Benadryl. That was the original molecule. It was first synthesized in the 1970s, but didn't come to clinical use until 1986. The first time in the US was 1988. And it was pretty much like, so if this was the first revolution of antidepressant treatment or depression treatment, this was the second revolution. And you had to wait almost 30 years to have the third revolution, which you are experiencing right now. People throw these names around: SSRIs, SARIs, SNRIs. So let's understand what they mean. Probably you understand, but this is a summary here. So SSRIs are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, meaning that they are inhibiting only the activity of the serotonin transporter and not any other transporter. Doesn't mean that they don't have any other effects on serotonin receptors, but that's selective about them is that they are selective for the serotonin transporter. Even that is not completely true. Serotonin antagonists and reuptake inhibitors, these are antagonists first and inhibitors second, so this activity is stronger than this activity. But they are still reuptake inhibitors, and medications are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, also have serotonin antagonist effects, just not as frequent, as not as strong. SNRIs, these are serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. Tricyclics, most of them are SNRIs. They are not, it's not really a functional description, is more a structural description, but the structural description actually conveys some functional similarities. You can see there is two kinds of tricyclic. One is more balanced, one is more norepinephrinergic. MAOIs, these are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. These do not affect the serotonin transporter. But again, like nothing is ever 100% true. Some of them have some effects, but the main effect is the MAO inhibition. And what is MAO? MAO is monoamine oxidase, and they oxidize monoamines. And, like serotonin, melatonin, histamine, norepinephrine. These are the monoamines. There's other monoamines that are food derived, and that's has clinical significance in avoiding side effects. And then all these other abbreviations that you see in Dr. Stahl's book, he loves them. Every single one of them has a single medication in them, so it's okay. Some of them just one medication in them, so it's like calling them a category is a little bit, I guess, overly ambitious, but nevertheless, so you're going to see these things, and we're going to discuss what they are. And then we have the NMDA antagonists, only one right now, ketamine, or two if you count ketamine and esketamine, but it's basically the same. And the GABAergic agents, again, there's only one right now, but more coming. So these are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. You probably know them. This is where it becomes non-selective because Zoloft is also a dopamine reuptake inhibitor, which can have significance in medication selection, also side effects. These are the old ones. The fluoxetine, sertraline, up down to escitalopram. And the last two are relatively recent, but even that is about 5-6 years old. And these are only branded at this point. There's no generic available. This is the serotonin antagonist and reuptake inhibitor. These are medications that are that do have some serotonin reuptake inhibiting effect, which is described here. So we have two, trazodone and nafazodone. This is just to, this is a screenshot from Wikipedia that shows all the receptor effects of trazodone. This is a medication with affecting tremendous number of receptors, which of course makes its use somewhat complicated, even though people like to just prescribe it as like vitamin, but it's it's a tricky medication if you think about it. But again, these are also serotonin reuptake inhibitors, just not as strong an effect as the others. SNRIs. The first one was venlafaxine, Effexor. Then came Effexor XR. In dosages less than 150, less than 100 milligram per day, it is pretty much an SSRI. The SNRI effect begins to occur over 150 milligram dose, and it becomes a balanced SNRI, serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, around 300 milligrams a day. Desvenlafaxine, which is the active metabolite of venlafaxine, was made into a medication. Actually, it seems to have some advantage over venlafaxine because it is quite well balanced at any dose levels. So even at lower dose levels, it is an SNRI. Duloxetine is Cymbalta. It's a strong SNRI, very well balanced. Milnacipran, which is called Savella in the US, it is a racemic mixture of D and L. Milnacipran is, anybody who doesn't know what racemic is, put us something on this chat and I'll explain. It is not marketed for depression in the US, but it is an antidepressant in many, many countries. This is the marketed version in the US. levo, milnacipran called Fatsima, and why it's green, I'll tell you later. Okay, so racemic means that some medications come in two forms, and they are mirror images of each other. And sometimes they don't. So imagine your hands. Put your hands in front of out, and spread your fingers out in front of you, and look at your hands. So they are identical, but they are mirror images of each other. So if you stick your right hand into Play-Doh, you can't fit your left hand into it, because it is, even though it's the same shape, but its mirror image doesn't go into that. So sometimes medications come in. Most of the time, when the medications are manufactured, this racemic mixture. Sometimes they both have the same effect. Sometimes they have different effects. So, for instance, milnacipran is like a mirror image, both the left hand and the right hand image of a milnacipran molecule. In the US, they took out the L version and made it into a medication, which works just as well as milnacipran, which also means that Sabella works just as well as Fatsima, so there's really no reason to use this version. So these are called stereoisomers. But again, the easiest way of imagining what these are is that you look at your two hands with your fingers stretched out, and that explains that why, even though they're identical in shape, it might not work. One might not work in the same imprint as the other. And don't forget that receptor sites are basically little holes into which a medication has to fit in. And if it's the wrong configuration, it may not fit into that hole. Maybe only the L or the D version fits into the hole. And the different versions may fit into different holes. Is it clear? I guess it is. Okay. These are the norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. Mostly, these are the secondary tricyclics. We'll discuss what it means. Most likely, this is one of the medications that, if you're going to be using a TCA, this is one of the most useful medications to use. The least amount of side effects, and fairly effective. This is probably never going to use it. This is a medication that is typically used by medical doctors, pain doctors, for pain. It's very rarely used in psychiatry anymore. I have never seen it used. Atomoxetine is a medication that tried to be marketed for depression in the US, failed. They tried to market it for ADD. It passed the test, but it is not a very successful ADD medication. Reboxetine is a medication that is not used in the US, but it's another norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor antidepressant. As I understand, is also not very effective. So these are strictly norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. Some of them have minimal serotonin reuptake inhibiting effect. Tricyclics, again, this is not a mechanism. This is a structure. So you have different tricyclics, and you will have different mechanism. But there is two groups of mechanisms that fall into two structural groups. The tertiary amines, which we're going to see in the second discussion of depression, what they are. These are the ones that are available. First generation, second generation. There are some others that are not categorized this way. Doxepin, which is nowadays used for sleep only. It's not used for depression. It's extremely sedating. And these are extremely rarely used, but they're here for the sake of completeness. And we have a miscellaneous monoaminergic agents. They have nothing in common in terms of structure or even activity. So, they just put them into this one slide. One of them is bupropion, Wellbutrin, or Zyban. I put this up. It has an amino ketone structure. Not that it's really important, but sometimes you read studies in which they compare, let's say, a serotonin agent and an aminocatone antidepressant, which is funny because there are only one. So to describe it as an aminocatone antidepressant, and if they just pick one out of many, I think it's just it's just silly. Anyway, so an aminocatone antidepressant is bupropion. It is a norepinephrine and dopamine reuptake inhibitor. Sorry for the spelling error. And we're going to discuss in great detail tomorrow. Mirtazapine, or Remeron, is a very interesting antidepressant. It is a tetracyclic structure, which again is not really that important, but it's usually mentioned. It is not a reuptake inhibitor at all, but it is a noradrenergic and specific serotonergic antidepressant according to Dr. Stahl, so that's a NASA. And then finally we have St. John's wort, which is very interesting because in Europe, some of the ingredients were taken out of St. John's wort and made into prescription medications. However, in the US, it is an herbal medication containing dozens of chemicals, and you have different kind of effects, virtually any kind of effects that you can imagine. The combined effects called the entourage effect that gives you the final antidepressant effect. Then we have the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. There are 4 on the market in the US, and they affect all 3 monoamines that are used are affected in depression, but they also affect the other monoamines like histamine, which is not a depression-related monoamine. But they affect both dopamine, they affect dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. So they have a total effect on these neurotransmitters. The one that's most they come in 2 forms, MAO-A and MAO-B. They have different functions. I'm not going to go into that, but they basically work on, so altogether they work all 3 monoamines, one of them, and then there's some distribution of which one works more on which, and in terms of the antidepressants. But medications that affect both are affecting all neurotransmitters. The most frequently used one is phenelzine, otherwise called as Nardil. And these 2 are used less frequently. This is probably never used anymore. It's fairly hepatotoxic. This is still used, actually. I just put a patient on it recently, to my surprise. MAO-B, so selegiline is a medication that affects only MAO-B in clinical dosages, but if you take it with an enzyme inhibitor, then you can increase the levels to high enough that it becomes a MAO-A and MAO-B inhibitor. It comes in a pill form and also comes in a patch, which is an antidepressant patch, useful in certain situations. The trimonoamine modulators, these are the these are natural chemicals that acting in the methylation pathways. Again, the methylation pathway that leads from tryptophan to serotonin. And if you know what the pathway is, you can look it up. It's like the 3 steps and different enzymes, and it leads from tryptophan to serotonin, and then in this parts of the brain, like the pineal gland, the serotonin gets transformed into melatonin. Methylfolate and okay, I'm just going to call it SAMe. These are the most frequently used, I can't really call them medications, but these are natural products that are used can be used in depression. Again, SAMe is OTC, only over-the-counter, only in the US, but there are prescription forms of this in Europe. Which means that they had to do pharmacological studies with that, and they should have seen separation from placebo in studies in order to get approved. So I would say that it's pretty strong indication that it's really a good antidepressant. Okay, so we're gonna go and have another little quiz. So if Aiden, you can put this up. Which of the following agents does not increase the concentration of monoamines in the synapse? NET is the norepinephrine transporter. DAT is the dopamine transporter. SERT is the serotonin transporter. VMAT is the vesicular monoamine transporter. And MAO is the monoamine oxidase. One more. See how close we can get to 80. Somebody doesn't see the poll. Okay, so what I'd like to do is somebody who picked D, explain why you didn't pick D. Why D is the correct answer? Just type it in quickly. Okay, then I'll do it. So the norepinephrine transport norepinephrine from the synapse back to the presynaptic terminal. If you block it, you will have no norepinephrine in the synapse. Same for dopamine transporter. If you block the transporter, there's less dopamine that gets transported back into this presynaptic terminal. There's more dopamine in the synapse. Same for serotonin. VMAT is a vesicular monoamine transporter, which is a transporter inside the presynaptic terminal, which takes up monoamines from the terminal itself into itself, so it does not affect the synapse. It is inside the cell. And therefore, it does not affect the concentration doesn't increase the concentration of monoamines in the synapse. And MAO, because it blocks the breakdown of monoamines, it will, of course, increase the concentration of monoamines in the synapse. So that's the answer. Okay. Again, this is just for the sake of information. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to know anything about it, but just want to expand your knowledge of what an antidepressant is. There are many more antidepressants that are available in the U.S. Some of them are with really interesting mechanism of action, and many of us in psychiatry wish that were available. Agomelatine would be one of them because it has probably a good effect on sleep, which is a big problem in depression. Moclobamide is a reversible selective MAO inhibitor. It makes it much less likely to have severe side effects. Who knows why they are not in the US? But anyway, so just understand that what we have here is a limited set of what is available in the world. Believe me, there are not going to be any questions about it. Okay, so this explains why things are green sometimes on the slides. And this is not here just to be cured, but it's here because it's important to pick medications aside from the hype or away from the hype or not giving into the hype. So when pharma companies get a medication patented, the patent lasts for a while and eventually runs out. And some of them are billion-dollar medications, and of course they hate to lose them. So then they do different kind of shenanigans to patent versions of the medication and unleash them on the unsuspecting public, who will have to pay high price for it, even though a perfectly good generic is available. So for instance, one of them is giving them a new indication. So this doxepin, which is a TCA, which hasn't been used as for depression in probably 20, 25 years. And the lowest dose is 10 milligrams. So the company made a 3 and 6 milligram version of doxepin, called it Silenor, and made it a branded medication, which is probably 50 times more expensive than the doxepin. And even though if you break a 10 milligram doxepin in half, it's a 10-cent pill, it's just as good as a 6 milligram Silenor, which is $4 a pill. Absolutely no reason to use it, but it's out there. FDA approves it, and it's one of the shenanigans that pharma people do. Active metabolite is another favorite, like Effexor to Pristiq. As it turns out, it is actually not 100% useless because it's a little bit different medication, but you're going to see it in many other areas, not just antidepressants, so just be aware of it. You say it's a new medication, they'll look it up. Is it an active metabolite? Ask the pharma rep if you see them, what is it, where is it coming from? Sometimes it makes sense, and there's a situation where it makes a lot of sense, but many times it does not. Sometimes it's just really silly that they give add a new salt, like bupropion hydrochloride is the usual formulation, so they make it hydrobromide, name it, give it a new name, and make it branded medication, which doesn't make any sense. Racemic to enantiomer, which is, I discussed before, Fetsima, came from Savella. Sorry, it should be Savella here and then Fetsima here. So Fetsima is a single enantiomer, comes from Savella, which is racemic. No difference whatsoever. Both of them are brand, so it really makes not much difference at this point, but Savella is going to be generic first, and at that point, there's absolutely no reason to use that medication. Sometimes they make combinations with unusual dosages. So for instance, Symbyax is a medication that has been FDA approved for treatment-resistant depression. What does it contain? It contains olanzapine 3 milligrams, which is Zyprexa, and fluoxetine 25 milligrams. These medications are not available 3 milligram and 25 milligram. It's available at 2.5 milligram and 20 milligram. If you combine them, 2.5 milligrams of olanzapine and 20 milligrams of fluoxetine is going to be just as good as 3 milligrams of olanzapine and 25 milligrams of olanzapine, except that this comes in one pill. It's going to cost you $5 a pill, and the other two pills, and it's going to cost you, I don't know, 20 cents a pill, or even less. So just be careful when you use these medications. Look up what they are, and if it makes no sense, don't use them. This is just a little, inside information. I already mentioned these before. These are the novel antidepressant agents. These two have been approved already. Actually, with the esketamine, the Spravato, and brexanolone, which is allopregnanolone combined with a molecule that allows it to go into go across the blood-brain barrier. These two medications are FDA approved. MDMA, which is ecstasy. Some of you guys may be surprised, some of you may not, but it's a medication that this is a chemical that is going to be turned into a medication. We're going to talk much more about it in the PTSD lecture, because that's where it is going to be, that actual studies are being done with MDMA with respect to PTSD. And then these are called serotonin releasing agents, psilocybin and LSD. And again, believe me or not, last time I checked, there were 36 clinical studies with psilocybin and depression in the US. So that is also coming. What are the potentials for abuse with these? With which one? With all of them? Okay. So ketamine, ecstasy, psilocybin, LSD are medications of use. All of them are medication of use with relatively low frequency and relatively low impact in society and for the person. I'm not saying these are not addictive medications, but compared to alcohol, compared to nicotine, compared to heroin, compared to methamphetamine, cocaine, these are medications with, these are drugs with less effect on the life of an individual and much less effect, much less societal disruptive effect. Again, we're using addictive medication in psychiatry. Amphetamines, we'll be using them. Benzodiazepines, we'll be using them. So just because something is addictive and escapes medical practice and gets out into the street, it doesn't mean that you can't use them with caution in medicine. Well, I'm not saying that they cannot cause serious abuse, serious problem, but again, compared to these are, I'm talking about statistically speaking, the statistical significance of LSD use in the US compared to the use of opiates is really minimal. Would you agree with that? Yeah. So again, believe me, these medications, just as ketamine, is embedded in this risk management system, which I'm going to talk about when we talk about ketamine in detail. Believe me, all these medications, once they go to official use, they're going to be embedded in this kind of a very restrictive system. On the other hand, there is now a sort of like a semi-underground treatment set of treatment providers that treat different kind of conditions with ecstasy or psilocybin, and that's unregulated. But again, I would say that compared to, I'm not saying that it doesn't have dangers potentially, but again, the danger of somebody treating and treatment-resistant depression with some psilocybin, even if it's not regulated, compared to people who are shooting up heroin, is really it's completely on a different level. There is no clinical use for heroin. There is no clinical justification ever, but there can be clinical justification of these medications for really severe forms of depression.
I'm going to have a whole class on addiction.
Could we compare possible use danger with other antidepressants? Well, antidepressants are, again, theoretically speaking, not addictive. Doesn't mean that they cannot have discontinuation effects, but there's no danger of abuse that Prozac has comparable with the danger of abuse for ketamine. Ketamine can be abused, and people are shooting up ketamine. Nobody's shooting up Prozac. So in that sense, SSRIs and traditional antidepressants are significantly safer for both for the individual and for society. Actually, even that is not true, because people snort Wellbutrin, and I knew people snort Ambien, people snort Paxil. So, but I would say that that's rare. Somebody snorted lithium, yes. Augmenting agents. Strictly speaking, there's combination and augmentation. There are two different things. Combination is when you add another antidepressant to the first antidepressant, and augmentation is when you add medication with a different mechanism of action. But you can just call both of them augmentation. Typically, you add serotonergic medication to a non-serotonergic, or a non-serotonin medication to a serotonergic medication. That's how we combine them. And augmentation is all these kind of different things that you can add to various kind of antidepressants, and we are going to talk about them in great detail. So you can combine the monoaminergic ones, bupropion, Wellbutrin. These you can use it if you need an activating effect, mirtazapine, if you need the opposite effect, or if you need the appetite increasing effect. Buspirone, which is not an antidepressant but has serotonergic effects. You can use it if anxiety is a problem. Amoxicillin, which is Strattera, you can use it if you want. It's like Wellbutrin. You can use it to add some energy and activity to the treatment response. These are the anti-dopaminergics. I like to use that term because it's true. It's always true. We call them antipsychotics. It is not always true, because in low dose these are not really antipsychotics. If you go them mood stabilizer, that is also not always true, because in high dose these are antipsychotics, not mood stabilizer, or at least antipsychotics as well. So in the order of becoming available, these are the anti-dopaminergic medications that are used for augmentation. I put olanzapine in this kind of a dark bracket because I strongly caution anybody using it. It is a perfectly good medication in the sense that it's very effective, probably the most effective in the line, But this is a medication that sometimes can cause really severe medical complications in terms of sudden onset severe diabetes, sudden onset severe triglyceridemia, incredible weight gain that is impossible to get off of. So it's really, you should use it in the last resort. These medications, again, these have some side effects. Quetiapine and aripiprazole can give you considerable weight gain. It's not that you don't have to worry about them here, but this is by far, it's just scary. Once you have a patient like that who ends up in the ICU 10 days after put them on olanzapine, then you're going to think about it. These are two new ones, brexpiprazole, which is, I should have put it in green because it is one of those pharma company shenanigans. Cariprazine is a new kind of mechanism of action. It's interesting medication. You can augment with real mood stabilizers. Lithium is one of them. Lithium has a pretty good antidepressant effect, and as Dr. Myers mentioned already, lithium has specific anti-suicidal effect. So always think about lithium, and you don't have to use it in high dose. Always think about lithium in a suicidal patient. Lamotrigine, which is Lamictal, it is approved for bipolar disorder and bipolar depression. It is not approved for augmenting antidepressants, but in clinical practice, it is used as an augmenter. You can use hormones as augmenting agents. Thyroid hormones, testosterone, estrogen are the ones that are used in psychiatry most frequently, and this is in the order of importance and frequency of use. Let me just look up. Okay. The nutraceuticals, these are agents that you can use for augmentation, but you can also use these agents in low-grade depression or in people who like not to take so-called antidepressants. If you don't call them antidepressants, then you take them, then they will take them. So these are over-the-counter medications in the US. Okay, I have a question. Up-down regulation of what? No. You're not treating. I mean, no. They actually, if upregulate something, they upregulate the receptors, the serotonin receptors. For instance, thyroid hormone increases serotonin availability in the brain. So you're not really looking at. You're not treating the medical conditions. You're using these medications for psychiatric reasons with psychiatric indications on psychiatric targets. So omega-3 fatty acids, 5-HTP, which is a precursor of serotonin, methylfolate, SAMe, which is in the triamonoamine circuitry, and vitamin D3. These are nutraceuticals that you can use for augmentation of different kind of antidepressants. You can even combine them together. I typically recommend people to take omega-3s, if for no other reason, because it's just good for you. The others, you have to be a little bit more targeted. You can't just tell anybody, okay, just take some methylfolate. Vitamin D is, again, probably a little bit, talk about it more, so I don't want to jump in here. Instrumental treatments, we're not going to talk about them in any way because this is psychopharmacology. But I'm mentioning it here, and I think there's mentioning them in another section. These are the ones that are available. This is the gold standard, basically. This is called repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. Why the R has to be low, I mean, in lowercase, I don't know, but it is usually lowercase if it's there. And these are really, really very rarely used. I mean, the VNS and DBS are really very rarely used treatments in really desperate situation. And direct current stimulation is something that you can buy things on Amazon and you can stimulate yourself with questionable efficacy. And light source is another instrumental treatment that has a role in treating seasonal depressive disorder. And that's what I was thinking when somebody said, so I'm going to be able to do fecal transplants in psychiatry. Eventually, everything ends up in psychiatry, even Botox. In 1997, it was used originally first, for the treatment of strabismus, which is an eye disorder when your eyes are looking at different direction. And then it went through all these approvals for cosmetics and dystonia, migraines, etc., etc. And eventually, now we have studies showing that it may be useful in depression as well. So who knows what else the future holds. It is actually in some preclinical phase. I have participated in some kind of group thing when I asked doctors their opinion, and I was showed how it's being done, and they make these little injection things that even psychiatrists are almost completely dummies as to how to use needles. They should be able to use it, and it's coming. It's going to be out there. And anybody who's allowed to use an injection needle is probably going to be able to do Botox for depression. Is it injected into, but there is we're going to talk about it tomorrow, it is injected into the forehead. Yes. No kidding. Getting close to the end of this presentation, we are talking about diagnostic procedures. There are very, very few diagnostic procedures in psychiatry as opposed to the vast majority of other specialties in medicine. Brain imaging, there's absolutely no clinical use for brain imaging for depression. There are some unscrupulous sites, for instance, the Amen Clinic or Amen Clinic in California, where you can go and get a PET scan done for, I don't know, tens of thousands of dollars, and you get a diagnosis of depression. Totally. I mean, I can't use words like that here, but it's totally unnecessary. So nothing in the brain that can be clinically useful. It is very useful in terms of doing studies with depression, but there's no clinical use. Psychogenetic testing is, on the other hand, fairly useful. It's getting more and more useful. There is science behind it. It tests receptor profiles, the genes for the receptor profiles, the genes for the metabolic enzymes, the genes for the methylfolate reductase, which is one of the enzymes that involves in this process of going from tryptophan to serotonin. And it allows a more rational selection of medications based on medication that you should favor or medication you should avoid, or augmenting agents that you should favor or avoid. There's biomarker testing. So what biomarkers we're thinking about, for instance, inflammatory markers. It's not, again, it is in preclinical stage. But sometime in the future, it's possible that's going to be available. I don't think that's going to be for the purpose of diagnosing depression. If somebody says, I'm depressed, I don't need a brain scan to tell me the patient is depressed. These things are going to be useful for medication selection, treatment selection, not the diagnosis itself. Now, this is a huge topic, and I don't want to get into that. And it's not something that I expect anybody to memorize, but there's certain things you should probably know because it's so frequent. Two of the metabolic enzymes in the CYP system, the 2D6 is the one that metabolizes most of the antidepressants. Some of them inhibit the enzyme, includes fluoxetine and paroxetine, which means that they inhibit their own mechanism, own metabolism. So you give them a certain dose, and 2 months later, it's 20 milligrams, but it's like as if you had given them 40 milligrams because they inhibit their own metabolism, and their blood level continues to increase. So you may see an increase in side effects, like in 3-4 months after you start the medication, and then you need to sort of like start coming down to a level that could roughly correspond to the blood level with an uninhibited enzyme. One of the most important things to know about bupropion is a very, very strong inhibitor of 2D6. And why is it important? Because you use bupropion as an augmenter. So if you augment medications with bupropion that are metabolized by 2D6, then you're not going to augment the effect, but you're also going to increase the effect of the blood level of those medications. And this is the way you can get into toxic side effects, into serotonin syndrome, etc. So you have to be aware of the fact that bupropion is a very strong inhibitor of 2D6. 3A4 is the most prevalent enzyme in the liver. That's when it metabolizes most of the medications, and antidepressants are a little bit different because they tend to favor 2D6. Interesting little tidbit that probably you should know, that grapefruit juice is an inhibitor. So again, you have a patient and they're stable on medication, and suddenly more side effects. Ask them, did you start drinking grapefruit juice? May turn out to be true, and then suddenly they have an inhibited CYP3A4, elevated blood levels, and side effects or toxicity. It is going to be also interesting with the trazodone, metabolism of trazodone, which we're going to discuss in great details, whether you like it or not, but it's important, so I will tell you. This is something that you should probably remember. It's called the Flockhart table. It has every single medication that you can imagine. On the table, you put in two different medications, and then it gives you a little, any medication you want. And it gives you a little matrix and tells you how these medications are affecting each other metabolically, pharmacokinetically. Here's a sample psychogenetic testing report. There's a full report that is uploaded on the Moodle, and you can see more of it. But so this is actually for one of my patients. This is one of the patients who had a great difference in treatment by selecting medications, taking this into consideration. He was just dragging on different kind of medications in high dosages for years, but it turns out that he had every single medication that he was taking, it was metabolized either by A12 or by, this is the glucuronidation enzyme. And none of the medication he was taking was able to reach blood level enough to become effective. So, all you have to do is change the medications to the ones that are in the normal range, and lo and behold, he responds to treatment. This is, again, a real clinical example. And this is a final quiz. So if Aidan could put this up, please.
What?
Okay, so we have quorum here. So I would say that let's go through the answers. GABA system modulators are used in the treatment of depression as of March of this year. I'm sorry, it just keeps popping through the middle, the poll. That's allopregnanolone, which is a GABA system modulator, which is used in the treatment of depression. It's a wonderful medication, very effective. And as I indicated in passing, that even in the past, the Xanax, which is a GABA system modulator, was considered to be used for depression. So yes, it can be used in treatment of depression, but certainly this year is as official as it can. Thank you. As efficient as it can be. All monoamine reuptake inhibitors are antidepressants. It is definitely not false, because it is true. And all antidepressants are monoamine reuptake inhibitors. It is false. Thyroid hormones indeed can be used for augmentation of antidepressants. This is one of the, again, you're going to see it, for instance, discussed by Dr. Myers in the STAR-D study, which is something that's important to know about. And again, vitamins can be used for augmentation of antidepressants. And this is the end, but before we stop, Dr. Myers would like to talk to you guys, so here she is.
Hi again, we'll take a break in a few minutes. We're going to take a 15-minute break when we do it. But first, I want to mention Dr. Papp and I had asked for people to please answer the question that we sent by email. That's asking for 2 questions. Thank you for the people that did it over the lunch break, but there are 3 people who have not done it. Please send that to me with the original email or the email address that you found on the first page. And the 3 people who have not sent me that answers are Abdullah, Angela, and Monica. So if I don't receive those, we'll just take the time of class so I can get it. And it's going to take you 30 seconds to answer the question. So coming up is a section about general prescribing guidelines. It's going to be a very painful session. Set of questions because we're going to go over the STAR-D study. And I want to find out if anybody in any class has talked about the STAR-D. Have you had any class that's covered basically clinical trials yet? No. Okay, so unfortunately, we're going to have to step through that study pretty carefully because it is considered the standard of practice. So we're going to reconvene in 15 minutes, please. So that is at 2:25. Okay, see you then. Bye-bye.
I just came back for a short time because I want to get back to the question, can augmentation with hormones induce up-down regulation? I think I didn't understand the question, but now I understand. can it cause changes in the hormones that in the glands that actually the hormones target? Yes. Again, that's not the goal. The hormones can do what the hormones do, and they affect the organs in a way, the following way. So there's a negative feedback between the end organ and the gland, and the pituitary. Just keep it simple. So if let's say the thyroid creates too much thyroid hormone, then the thyroid, the pituitary shuts down or reduces TSH. That stimulates the thyroid less, which is going to reduce the reduction of thyroid hormone, and it maintains the balance. Now, if you put thyroid hormone in the system, then it's going to look like for the pituitary that it that the thyroid gland created too much thyroid hormone, so that's why it's going to shut itself down. I mean, it's going to reduce the release of TSH, and the same for other hormones. So, and because the TSH production is reduced, there could be actually an effect on the end organs in that they become less and less active, and actually can seen with testosterone, that you put too much testosterone in the person, then the testes actually begin to show some shrinkage, and is because the FSH, the follicular stimulating hormone, which is another hormone from the pituitary, is the blood level is reduced by the extra testosterone you put in the patient, and therefore there is less stimulation to the gland. So what you have, if you do augmentation with these hormones, you can have side effects on the end organs that their activity may get reduced. It is something that you want to avoid. If that's what you meant by upregulation, downregulation, then yes, it can happen. There's no upregulation because it's upregulated by the stimulating hormone that come from the pituitary, but definitely they can be downregulated and in activity by putting in a hormone artificially that they themselves would be producing. I hope that it's helpful. Okay, so here is Dr. Myers.
Okay, so back again. And as I mentioned, this is going to be, some of this is fairly slow moving stuff because of the clinical trial stuff, and my most unfavorite part of learning, but necessary piece of it. So, first of all, so on this page here, I have Gabbard's treatment of psychiatric disorder. There's certainly a newer version of this. I sort of, the skeleton of this this presentation I did, sort of Gabbard formed the sort of skeleton of it, and lots of new information. So, go to a newer version of it. But I did, it's on your posting. I posted it so you can kind of see what's in it. I don't know if you're familiar with that particular resource, but it's a good one. So I think in general, in terms of prescribing guidelines, I think there are going to be a lot of initial sort of disagreements with what I'm going to say. But really what I'm trying to give you as a general guideline of how particularly beginning prescribers are going to be thinking about treating for depression. So Dr. Papp has given you a good sort of introduction to the medications. So then when they come up in this presentation, you'll know the general categories of things. And then he's going to be talking, a lot more in terms of each specific medication and how to use it. And then there'll be another presentation by him on specific presentations, so how to use each medication, but then how to treat specific depressive presentations, because as we learned in the lecture about diagnosis, it's not all just one thing. So there we go. So as we talked about in terms of, I gave you each sort of diagnosis and how you think about prescribing based on that particular diagnosis. We learn that really when it's severe, that's when you prescribe. And so severe is going to mean, so for example, that case of Maria, it's going to be sleep and appetite disturbance. So in that case, she had lost 11 pounds, fatigue, decreased sex drive, restlessness, agitation, or psychomotor retardation, variations in mood over the course of a day, and impaired concentration for forgetfulness. Those are really the sort of the pronounced, sustained physiological symptoms you're going to think about prescribing for. So that's pronounced, that first one. And then melancholia, psychosis, catatonia, or suicidality are present. You're going to think that this is a time when you need to prescribe. Significant functional impairment, clearly, if you can't get out of bed, it's a time to think about medication. Again, sort of reviewing what we said before, that moderate to severe, so mild psychotherapy, moderate psychotherapy, or psychotherapy plus medication, and severe medication and then plus psychotherapy. I don't think there's anything that doesn't do better with psychotherapy, frankly, unless the patient can't pay for it or can't benefit from it because of other factors. So one of the things you're going to consider about when to prescribe is really when it's age appropriate. So this is from the famous Dr. Stahl, a little a chart here about the cost-benefit ratio, basically, of risk-benefit of different age groups. So 6 to 12-year-olds, I mean, we're not treating, talking about children. That's all going to be covered, I believe, in one day by somebody else. But they really have the worst risk-benefit from it. And then the elderly may not respond as quickly. There are more side effects, but at least there's not a lot of risk of suicidality from that group. 1824, and this is the stuff you have to know. This is a memorization kind of thing. 18 to 24 years old, there's a black box. Beware of risk of suicidality. Dr. Papp has seen it a number of times in his own practice. And so you have to be very, very careful with this age group. It doesn't mean that you don't prescribe. It just means you're very careful. And then adults 25 to 65 really have the best response with pretty good tolerability. So there are times that medication can be appropriate for some patients. So these, stable patients who are maintenance treatment, they've maybe been on it for years, they're doing fine on it. They don't want psychotherapy because they've been all through that, over and over again. Not that people can't benefit from more, but those are good patients to just say, okay, medication alone. And then there are some poor psychotherapy candidates. For some people, trying to get to for psychotherapy on a weekly basis or monthly basis is very difficult. There's certainly rural areas that it's going to be more difficult for people. Patients that really can't comply with the psychotherapy, or their level of functioning or willingness to do psychotherapy is very low. There's some people who just want medication. And then there are also cost time issues. And if they don't have insurance, I mean, the truth is treating with Prozac is a whole lot cheaper than treating with psychotherapy for some people. So unfortunately, there's some people that medication is just either psychotherapy is just not possible to have, or they don't need it. So when to prescribe, again, when the patient is willing, but not necessarily because they want it. I mean, I certainly had those patients that come in because I offer medication consult, and I do a lot of referrals with psychiatrists, and I'm sure well, I know Dr. Pappas had this himself. They come in and they want an antidepressant, but there's no real indication for it. So it's a rare thing, but it does happen. And if there's particularly some sort of environmental event that we can see is contributing to it, and the level of depression isn't severe, it may be far better to tell them, to wait a while and see if you can, get through this. And I think we as psychologists would probably all agree with that. That's a good choice. So here are sort of the categories that Dr. Papp talked about. It is not comprehensive, but I think just to be able to have this would be a good slide to maybe even have printed out for yourself before the exam, so you can kind of orient yourself to the different medications, make your own notes on it or add some things that Dr. Papp would talk about, but it's a good start for it. So we've got the first generation of medications that are usually considered second-line medications. We have the second generation antidepressants, which are really considered first line, and then these sorts of other medications or supplements. And so since I do not have prescriptive authority here in California, I often suggest nutraceuticals, herbal supplements. St. John's wort is something I use a lot with patients myself. I encourage them to get genetic testing so they can see if methylfolate is going to be helpful for them. I talk about omega-3 fatty acids and probiotics. So there are a lot of things that you can do to sort of treat even if you don't have authority. Okay, so there's little differences. Dr. Papp said, well, I think, did you talk about this efficacy between them? So, okay, so there's really little difference in efficacy between the traditional antidepressants. So, I mean, you'll have people that say, I only do okay on Prozac, or I only do okay on Paxil, or whatever it is. And the truth is, it's usually the side effect profile that we're talking about, which is really the larger difference between the different medications. And most of them work on the monoamine system, boosting different synaptic action of the neurotransmitters, as Dr. Papp has gone over. So which ones you start with are going to be not quite as important as people might think. All right, let me go on here. This sort of art of prescribing that I'm sure you've talked about in other classes is a trial and error for a lot of medications. We're going to talk about a clinical trial that is really going to give you sort of a cookbook in order to follow when you're prescribing. So this sort of, in my notes here, one thing that is very important is for you to really talk to the patient, educate the patients about the process, that this is going to take time, that the delay in the antidepressant effect is going to be not just because you need to get up to the therapeutic level, so you're going to start low and titrate upwards, but there are a lot of things that are turned on downstream that just take time, the gene expression in particular. And everybody's got different sort of genetic and epigenetic differences that's going to change their response, even their attitudes about medication and the environmental pressures that they're going to have. So if they really don't believe that antidepressant is going to work, that's not going to be very helpful in terms of how fast it's going to work, as we know the placebo response is real. And then if the patient is, experiencing really severe environmental pressures, sometimes no amount of medication is going to overcome that. So you have to consider the different sort of presentations that the patient is experiencing in their environment about how fast the medication is going to work. And then, of course, the severity of the depression and other co-occurring factors like anxiety. So someone with severe depression, it's just going to take them longer to get out of that situation. So educating them prior to treatment about the length of response is going to be very important. So as I mentioned, that the efficacy of the antidepressants is really similar across them, but their side effect profiles do differ. So the antidepressant that you're going to choose is based on the individual patient's presentation, what they can tolerate in terms of side effects, their core morbid conditions, like, for example, if they have sleep issues, if they have weight issues, you're going to think about different medications, or not specific medications. And then, of course, you're always going to think about that individual sort of pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. And I really believe that the psychogenetic testing now is, it seems to be more and more in practice in order to be able to see really, if medications aren't being helpful, why not? Or if they're having more side effects, why that is. And then their preference and ability to comply. So if you really think the best medication for this patient is, for example, Prozac, and they say, well, I'm only going to take escitalopram, well, you're going to think a whole lot about giving escitalopram because they're not going to take the Prozac. So choosing a first-line medication. So this line is in blue for a reason, is that you're going to choose FDA approved over non-FDA approved if all else equal, particularly when you're first starting to prescribe. So you're going to, are you going to talk about this more, Dr. Papp, so just because it is not FDA approved doesn't mean you can't use it. However, if you're going to use a non-FDA approved medication for a particular indication, you need to have some justification of why you're going to be able to, why you're using it. So it's not just because it's in your table that's another antidepressant. You need to have some sort of study that says why this is going to be effective for this particular effect. So you're always going to think about FDA approved over non-FDA approved. Is this something you've heard in other classes or not? Has anybody heard this in other classes about doing the FDA approved? Can people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, all right. For medication naive patients, you're going to start with medication with the best efficacy to side effect profile per research data, again, research data. Or you're going to start with the medication that worked in the past for them. Oh, excuse me, that's naive patients. Yeah, it's going to work for one that worked for a first degree relative. So if Lexapro worked for their mother, then that's not a bad one to start with, because we know that there is some overlap with first degree relatives. So for non-medication naive patients, if there was a medication that worked in the past, makes total sense to continue that medication. But if it didn't work before, it is unlikely to work now. But of course, with the caveat there is if it was given at therapeutic dose. So, I mean, a lot of people come in and say, well, I've tried all this, I've tried everything. But probably the truth is, for a lot of those medications, they've never gotten up to a therapeutic dose. They either stopped it very quickly, they had a prescriber didn't know appropriate therapeutic dose. So you can retry that medication if you don't think it was at therapeutic dose. And then if nothing has worked at the past, then you're going to choose a medication from a different class. So if none of the SSRIs worked or SNRIs, you may think about something like a tricyclic or something else like ketamine. So another choice for the first-line medication is their symptomatic presentation. You're going to target the symptoms, not just the disorder, because as we said, depression is not just one thing. So for example, if they have an anxiety presentation, you probably wouldn't choose something like bupropion first. You probably would choose something like that is FDA approved for it, like escitalopram. The presentations are really going to point to what you're going to consider as the first line medication. Again, the patient preference and their ability to comply. So, if the pharma rep came in and gave you Trintellix and The patient doesn't have doesn't have the money to pay for that. You're certainly not going to think that as that a first-line medication. Is unlikely that the insurance is going to cover something like that if it's a first-line medication. So you're going to think about affordability, of course. So this is where we start thinking about the side effects of the medication as being either wanted or unwanted. So generally in the newer generation antidepressants, the SSRIs, SNRIs, you're going to find less side effects, and that's why we consider them first line. The tricyclics are going to be more broad spectrum, generally less selective, and therefore give more side effects. Wanted side effects might indicate a particular medication. I mean, a really good example is choosing something like, particularly as an adjunct, something like mirtazapine, because it has more sleep effects and helps people to stimulate their appetite. So you can either use that as an adjunctive or even a first line, because, for example, if a patient is just not eating, or if they've have not been able to sleep at all, it's going to regulate that as well. So underwanted side effects are particularly problematic, and certainly in certain patients, but just in general, in depressed patients, they have a very, very low tolerance for any kind of side effects. Then there might be side effects such as that are more problematic, for example, because of blood pressure problems like MAOIs or trazodone, which can actually are a problem if people have lower blood pressure. So you want to be thinking about that. People with a risk history of seizures, for example, are not going to be choosing bupropion. So you want to think about what side effects for that particular person. Slow metabolizers, again, this is something you can find from genetic testing, are more likely to experience more side effects, clearly, because it's not clearing, it's not clearing the system. And then generic products can have a unique and unexpected set of side effects. So if, for example, a patient has been using the same medication without problems, and they come to you and they say they've got side effects, ask them, they said, did you get a new prescription? Did the pill look any different? So it can have just small little differences in terms of their substrates that are going to cause different side effects. So Dr. Papp is going to talk in extensive detail about this, but these are some of the comorbid disorders, both psychiatric and medical, that you want to look for in choosing a first-line medication. So a really common one is the smoking cessation. Bupropion can be very helpful. So that's Wellbutrin. It helps smoking cessation. And then we look at something like if the patient is already overweight, you're not going to choose paroxetine, that's Paxil, and you're not going to choose mirtazapine, which is Remeron, because they can have quite a bit of weight gain even beyond the number of calories that the person is taking in. So here, I'm not going to go into this a little more because Dr. Papp, I believe, is going to be covering this sort of thing, right? Okay. So just sort of the obvious to consider. We talked about the age, pregnancy status. So I don't know if Dr. Papp goes into this, the pregnancy at all. He'll go into a little bit. I believe you have a whole class about pregnancy or childbearing, I think, where they cover it more carefully. But people can take antidepressants when they're pregnant. It really depends on the risk factors. So if you have a patient that is really at risk of severe depression, I mean that can have as much effect on fetal development as the medication might as well. But you're going to look at the other sort of factors that are going to go into it. There are drug interactions. There are some medications that are clear red flags in terms of interactions because of the enzyme inhibition or inhibition. But you want to be very careful about looking at those sort of interactions. So this again, just sort of giving an overview about the sorts of things to prove. So to start with. So let's do one little quiz here. We're not going to have a lot of quiz in this afternoon's lecture because I know you're all flagging. So Aiden, we need that. There we go. So when should an antidepressant maintenance become indefinite? A, following remission from one episode of major depressive disorder. B, following remission from 2 episodes. C, following remission from 3 episodes. D, if the initial depression was severe or had suicidality. Or E, on a case-by-case basis. We got 70%. I know we can do it. Come on, guys. People are asleep after lunch, I assume. Now we got 18. Okay. So one thing to mention about some of these slides that I'm giving about the things to look at, if on your exam you have a case, this is where you're going to think about those sorts of things in particular for the test. Is okay, what is this particular patient? Is this within a age group that the medication is appropriate? Is this, what is the presentation? So it's a good guideline for you when you're answering questions about the cases. Okay, so for our poll, we're going to go ahead and complete it now. And then I'll give you the answer later. So on a case-by-case basis was the number 1 response, and second response was following remission from 3 episodes of depression. Okay, so let's find out. So this is the 5 R's. I want you to know this. This is something I think anybody prescribing antidepressants ought to know. Response, the definition is 50% reduction of symptoms. So the poll keeps coming back here. Remission means complete recovery for the first several months. Recovery is remission that is sustained for 6 months. Relapse, depression returns before remission within several months. And recurrence, depression returns after a patient has recovered. Partial remission is just if the full criteria is not met or a period less than 2 months. So we'll come back to this, but this is a slide I want you to know. So let's look at this. This is a great chart, I think. So this is the, we can see the R's here. So you're going along in normal mood, and then we see this sort of progression of depression. And so now we give a medication here, right? Oh, excuse me, we give a treatment right here. And when it reaches this point, it's not an objective point, but a subjective point here, there's a response, right? And then if you stop treating, this is what's going to happen. There's going to have a relapse. So you continue treating until remission. So essentially all of the symptoms are gone, and you continue, keep treating for 4 to 9 months. Then that is when you reach recovery, and you can either keep the patient on a maintenance dose, or if you stop the maintenance dose, there's going to be a potential of recurrence. If you stop it before recovery, there's going to be a relapse here. So preventing relapse is important to treat to remission. So in the initial phase, it's that start low, go slow. So you're going to start titrating up the medication. You're going to pursue really the minimum effective dose. You don't want any more than really does the job, but you're going to go as high as needed. So one of the most common reasons for treatment failure is that the dose hasn't been adequate. So you need to push the dose up. Sometimes it's even pushed up higher than is considered to be FDA, FDA approved. And then you're going to augment or switch if the addict trial fails of the first medication to achieve remission. We'll talk about how you do that. If the patient is severe, so we're talking about, if we're talking about a severe suicidal, agitator, psychotic, you're going to try to push that dose more quickly. This is a very ill patient you're talking about. You're going to consider augmenting more quickly. And you might even want to refer to inpatient so that the patient can be saved and the dose can be pushed more quickly. And you're going to treat to remission. So when we're thinking about response rate versus placebo rate in this first initial phase, so the first 8 weeks, response is about 2/3 and placebo is about 1/3. Don't discount that placebo. So again, here we see the chart again. We're going to look at this continuation phase. So the continuation phase is treating 4 to 9 months after remission. So here is if a placebo is given after remission, then you're going to have 50% relapse rate here. So if the drug is continued completed to continue, they're only going to have a 10% relapse rate. So you really want to work on reducing the relapse rate. So the maintenance phase, it is recommended, and those of you answered following 3 remissions are partially correct. It is recommended that after 3 occurrences that you continue on a maintenance antidepressant. Only 20% here only 20% have just 1 single episode. So we can see after 1 episode, there's a 50% chance of another depressive episode. After 2, it's 70%, and after 3, it's 90. I mean, we're talking about, a large majority of the people are going to have more. So if they've had 3, there's this maintenance dose you want to continue them on. You want to treat until all the symptoms remit to decrease this chance of relapse. So before 2006, really the standard of practice was to treat to response, but really the current thinking is to treat to remission. Partial responders, if you don't treat to full recovery, there's going to be more chance of a low-grade chronic depression or a complete relapse. Some of these residual symptoms, some of the residual symptoms really are easier to treat than others. So the mood itself, the suicide ideation, in most cases, psychomotor retardation, they're going to be the first things that go easier to treat. And it's harder to get rid of some of those vegetative symptoms like sleep, pain, motivation, and anxiety. So it may take longer or need more aggressive treatment in order to, with another mechanism, drug with another mechanism of action to achieve those things. So remission is rarely reached with the first treatment. You might need to have more sort of aggressive treatment with more than 1 agent. So according to one published research, the fatigue is a really common symptom of depression that persists in 20 to 30% of patients. So that's this sort of vegetative symptoms that persist. Okay. So the relapse rate, 10 to 20% are treated for 6 months, and then it just keeps increasing if with amount of time here. The results of treatment failure is just that the relapse rate just keeps increasing more and more. You can develop this treatment resistance that no medication seems like it's going to get rid of it. The disease progression and morbidity, mortality, and as Dr. Papp talked to you about, there's actually, it's neurotoxic, and this sort of chronic demoralization. They're skeptical of any kind of treatment. So if they keep getting medication, that's, medications, and they keep failing, they're not going to believe in any sort of antidepressant. So let's go back to this. And those of you who answered C, following remission from 3 episodes of major depressive disorder, yes, absolutely, that is the standard of practice. However, I would argue that really E on a case-by-case basis, because in the end, you've got to have the patient there in front of you, what they're telling you, and if they've had 3 episodes of major depressive disorder and they're not going to continue it, or there are other factors that are involved that might even make it dangerous to be on one of the antidepressants they've been on, then clearly you're going to take that into consideration. But C is really the answer in terms of probably if you're taking the PEP exam, what they're going to want to see. Okay, so again, my favorite part here. So we're going to talk, there are a number of studies, lots of studies. We're only going to talk about 2. We're going to talk about the VAST-D in the PTS lecture, partly because there just isn't as much information to talk about PTSD, so there's a little bit more time. So we're going to talk about the STAR-D study. And you've said that you haven't had it, so we will slog through it. So this is the largest and longest treatment study to evaluate depression. It's really the gold standard for prescribing. There haven't been many new drugs out after the STAR-D until just fairly recently, when these new drugs that Dr. Papp told you about. And what it's really was looking for was, what is the best available treatment in a way that is really reflects clinical practice. So they took 4,000 adults at 41 sites, both primary care and psychiatric care. So trying to put them in real situations in order to determine what the best next step was. So, okay, we're going to give initial medication, and then what do you do next? And they compared the efficacy of these treatment approaches. It was a fairly ill patient population here. Of the participants, 80% had chronic or recurrent depression. 25% of them had been depressed for greater than 2 years. And they had 3 medical illnesses on average, and quite a bit of psychiatric comorbidity. So how many of you actually have heard of the STAR-D? Have people heard of it? So I don't know, is my chat working? Could somebody just say something in the chat?
Yep, we can hear you. And people are typing if you can't see it in your chat.
Yeah, I can't see anything. Here we go. Wait. Okay, I haven't been able to see any chat for a while. Okay, I got it now. Just a minute, let me look at some of the, because they hadn't come through yet. There was a question back about depression injected. Oh, that was about the Botox. Okay. Sorry, it wasn't showing there. I got it now. So here's the basic treatment design. So there are going to be 4 different levels. They're treated for 12 weeks at each of these levels. And then we're going to look how they are switched between the different levels. So here's level 1. So they're going to start out with citalopram, that's Celexa. And then, oops, okay. It's on 2 different slides. All right, so the response rate was 60% with this single medication, the remission rate 30%, and those who were recovered, they went into a follow-up phase, and then those who did not remit were sent to level 2. So first of all, are there any questions about sort of what we're trying to achieve here in terms of understanding this design? The basic idea is to see how things are done in sort of an algorithmic sort of way. So here is your sort of cookbook of how you would prescribe first line, second line, augmentation, switching. So that's sort of the, and then there were a certain number of people who actually exited this study. Here's a nice little chart of after the first phase, the depressive symptoms. This is using this QIDS-SR score, which I'm not familiar with myself. This is up after the 12 weeks of treatment. We can see there are certain percentages, these 33% that remit, and then sort of a trailing down into these very severe symptoms here. So the level 2 for, and there's a 2A phase, but I'm not going to talk about that. It just gets too confusing for what we're trying to do here. But for non-remitters from phase 1, you've got 2 choices. You're going to either switch, so you're going to stop the citalopram, and they switch them to either venlafaxine, bupropion, sertraline, CBT, and the average time for remission within this group was 6 weeks. Or if they don't switch, they augmented. So they kept the citalopram of the dose that they were on, and then they added Wellbutrin or bupropion, buspirone, or CBT. So this is level 2. Not sure why these are on separate slides, but so from level 1, here's what we just talked about. Here's the switch option, and here is the augmentation option. So we haven't talked about it, but when you're switching, there's usually titration up and down. When you're augmenting, you're going to keep at the same level of the medication and then just add on to it. At this level, there was a 55% that reached remission. Augmenting was a little bit higher yield and faster to remission than switching, but not a whole lot. So. Now we move on to level 3. So from this group, from level 2, the patients came in and they were randomized, and you had 2 options again. There was a switching option, and the 2 switches were to either mirtazapine or nortriptyline, or there was augmentation, and the augmentation was either lithium or thyroid T3. And of those, there was 20% remission within this group, and those that did not went to level 4. So here at level 3, we had lithium and the T3 were considered to be equally effective, and the mirtazapine and the nortriptyline were also effective. So here we have 99 of these participants were considered to have left the study and remitted, and then the rest were sent on to level 4. And 169 people exited the study. So on to level 4. In this study, we had either the Parnate they switched to either Parnate or venlafaxine plus mirtazapine. That's Effexor and Remeron. It was significantly better tolerated than the Parnate, and I can't really pronounce that name well, so it's Parnate. So then there was 10% achieved remission from this group. Okay, so let's summarize what happened here. Oh, first, just a little sideline. So remember I mentioned that anxiety was such a common comorbid condition with depression that we really need to look at it separately. So the prevalence of anxious depression within the STAR-D was that the typical outpatient had greater than 2 anxiety symptoms. And it was, anxiety is very strongly associated with comorbidities and associated with non-response to the that first level, which is just citalopram level 1, and associated with non-response to all subsequent medications, higher relapse rate, and really didn't predict a favorable response to adjunctive buspirone either. So the scores, these are done on the HAM-D scale, but it really does not speak well in terms of response for people with particularly severe anxious depression in terms of their response to medication. So this is just a summary of it, and I don't want to belabor too much, but I'll just review quickly. So the initial treatment was citalopram. Then you're either going to switch to bupropion, CBT, sertraline, or venlafaxine, or you're going to augment. So it's a switch or augment. And then if they had only been receiving the CBT, this is the 2A I didn't talk about. They're going to go into A level and you're going to switch to bupropion or venlafaxine. So it confuses it a little bit. But the level 3, it's another switch or augment, and then at level 4, you're going to switch. So this is the STAR-D model. This is considered to be standard of practice, and it doesn't mean that you're going to use these particular medications, but that it is initial medication, switch or augment, then switch or augment, switch or augment. That's the basics of it. So this is a summary of how to prescribe STAR-D. And again, when you're first learning how to prescribe, you want to think this sort of algorithmic approach, that the initial medication phase is that you're going to titrate upwards until a standard dose is reaching over 6 weeks. And you, of course, need to use clinical judgment about individual response. Keeping in mind that most treatment failure is due to inadequate dose. You need to bump it up to the higher doses. So the early responders, you're going to see, like 2 to 4 weeks, and usually means you're on the right track. So there's some response. It's probably the right medication. But if there's no response after 4 or 5 weeks, you're going to increase the dose. Some late responders are going to take a little bit longer. But if there is significant partial response, you're going to add another 4 to 6 weeks. So basically it's saying, okay, here's my initial medication. It's working. Something's working. I'm going to keep with it or bump up the dose. So if there is if partial or no response after the initial phase, you're going to either combine, augment, or switch. So combining means you're going to add another class of antidepressants. For example, an SSRI plus bupropion. You are not going to do 2 SSRIs. It doesn't make any sense, and it's dangerous. Or you're going to augment. For example, you're going to take the SSRI you started with. And again, SSRI or SNRI is really for the first-line medication. So the other choice is to augment, so SSRI with lithium or T3, stimulants, buspirone, so you can add different sort of augmenting agents, or you're going to switch. So you're going to do a completely another class of antidepressants or the same class. It's not very often that you're going to switch within the same class. So for example, going from, let's say, citalopram to escitalopram wouldn't be very common, except that if you needed to bump the dose up too much, you can only go so high on citalopram. Or if, for example, a patient is having side effects. So some medications may, for example, have more GI side effects than another, so you might switch them within the same class. But usually you're thinking a different class. So if you were giving an SSRI, you might switch to bupropion, for example. So if there is failure to improve after 4 to 6 weeks at a high dose, so in the second phase, you're going to do the combined augment switch again. And you're going to then treat to recovery which means 6 months after remission. And when I told you there are a few things I want you to really know, I want you to know that 6 months after remission is the standard of practice to treat. So you treat past the point that they've gotten well. And this is something, again, I think a patient needs to be informed of before, when they first start the medication, because there's a very strong, for some patients to just quit when they feel better. You say, I feel better, so I need to quit, instead of understanding that their chance of relapse is higher, and they need to stay on the medication. And I think if you tell them beforehand, it's really helpful. So this is the standard STAR-D. Again, the PEP, my guess is you probably see this on that exam. And if you're prescribing for the, sort of all of the STAR-D, you can justify your treatment pretty well. So you're not doing anything that's really out of the loop. So this is a more sort of contemporary antidepressant therapy to follow up. Sort of, not as exact as the STAR-D, but it's really how most prescribers are treating. So they're going to start. So this is equivalent to the level 1 of STAR-D. You're going to begin with an adequate trial of the first-line antidepressant, usually a generic formulation of an SSRI or an SNRI. So, why start with a non-generic formulation? Why start with Trintellix, which costs a fortune, and usually an insurance company won't cover, starting with something like escitalopram or Prozac is just makes a lot more sense. And and you always, again, think about the cost. And then level 2. So if it's not working, you're either going to switch to another first-line antidepressant, or you're going to augment. But this sort of level 2 here is switching to a different first-line antidepressant or a different type of medication. So, example, from an SSRI to a mirtazapine. At level 3. You're going to think more of the patented antidepressants. So maybe Trintellix is the one your patient needs. Or you're going to start combining and add adjunctive strategies or older antidepressants like the tricyclics or the MOIs. Now at level 4, this is where your level 1 through 3 just didn't work. You're going to start thinking more novel agents. You're going to think about referring out for TMS or ECT. So, for example, the patient just with severe depression that just doesn't remit, and you can give them antidepressants forever. They're just not budging. And something like ketamine or ECT may be really the treatment of choice. And level 5 is this sort of unproven or experimental strategies. That's really the most severe cases. My guess, as psychologists, you probably wouldn't be, at least when you first start prescribing, aren't going to be seeing at that level. So this is where you're all going to get a little bit depressed here. Dr. Papp has already sort of cued you into some of the things that you're going to face. That there's treatment resistance, there's not a lot of difference between placebo, but here's some of the good and bad news. So 50% of the first episode of major depressive disorders don't have a second episode. So that's good. So 50%, but that means 50% do. And as I already mentioned, there's really little specific efficacy of the antidepressants over placebo. It's like 10 to 20%. So we have on some of the slides this Fated Love that Dr. Papp mentioned. If you I don't know if that's available for you, but that same author has put out a lot of information on this sort of thing if you want to read it. So there hasn't been a lot of efficacy of the antidepressants that have been out there for now. Few new drugs in the last 50 years other than the monoamines. But here's that little good news that the best outcome adds psychotherapy. So I think as if you become, as a prescribing psychologist, you really get this, that if you add psychotherapy to any sort of antidepressant treatment, practically you're going to have a better outcome. So there's this very slow onset of action that you're going to talk to your patients about. I mean, it can take weeks and weeks and weeks before you really, get the patient out of a severe depressive episode. And there may be these intolerable side effects that come about 10%, and you have to switch, or you have to they won't take it anymore. But here, if you look on this chart here, so the switching too quickly resets response to day 1. So if you decide to switch, here's a study that was done here, and you can see there was a switch. So the blue is switched from the non-switched. And basically, this is the HAM-D score, so we want lower. But if you switch, it basically wipes out that whole first week of improvement. They just are steady. So switching is not generally the best way to do it if you have other choices, but it may be the only thing you can. But it's going to take longer if you do that. So this relapse and treatment-resistant depression, this is where there's good news and bad news on it, but it's 20 to 30%. So with the monoamine therapies, you're going to have at least 20% that just are chronic relapsers or treatment resistant. They're just not getting better. And at least for me, as psychologist, is one of the most disheartening things to have, where I'm doing my best with psychotherapy, and I've got them in the best with the best psychiatrist, which is Dr. Papp in most cases, and they're not getting better. But that's because they've got this sort of treatment resistance. So then you got to start the prescriber starts thinking out of the box here. So even while on an antidepressant therapy, there can be relapse, and I'm not quite sure what the percentage of that is, but it's pretty disheartening to think about. And then if there's rapid discontinuation, so if the patient suddenly can't afford the medication anymore, or has this sudden great idea to stop medication, there's a much higher risk of relapse. And the more treatment steps you have, so remember this, up to the third episode, the STAR-D, each treatment episode you have, there's a lower and lower sort of higher relapse risk. And there's a longer time to remission. The longer the time to remission, the higher the relapse risk too. The 15% of patients after the first episode have no depression-free years for decades. Again, that's within this treatment-resistant depression. It is not good news for antidepressants. Are there any questions at this point? Nope. They're all just fading out, I think. I was in this program. We had to sit in a classroom, and so it was a lot harder to fade out because they were watching you. So this is looking again at this rapid versus gradual discontinuation of antidepressants. So here we can see in the blue, the gradual that with the gradual discontinuation that is in blue, afraid to use my mouse here, that there's going to be more patients that stay stable. This is on the y-axis is percent of patients remaining stable. And in the red line is with rapid discontinuation. You can see it's a much faster decline of the people remaining stable. So there was a meta-analysis of 400 patients with various diagnoses with mean length of treatment 8.5 months. This is this study here, and the gradual discontinuation was over 14 days, and rapid discontinuation less than 7 days. So we're not talking about even a great difference in discontinuation. My recommendation for patients is always to go down slowly, slowly, slowly. So 14 days I don't think is slow enough for most people. So of course it depends on both their prescriber and what the patient wants, but I think it absolutely slower is better for people. And there was no difference between the antidepressant types in terms of this discontinuation problem. And Dr. Papp is going to talk more about discontinuation syndrome. So here's a very large meta-analysis. The design of it included all data. So this was presented at this a recent conference that we went to about this huge meta-analysis was done. So it was STAR-D. Not everything was basically published within it. Am I getting that right? All the data.
Pharma studies.
Yeah,
Pharma companies.
Pharma companies, right? So, so this meta-analysis included all data. So they gathered stuff from the FDA, I believe, which had you can get that data if you need it. If it's not necessarily published. Of course, you know the pharma companies aren't going to want to publish stuff that doesn't look good. So they got all of that. They grabbed some things off of various places and to evaluate the changes in these depression scores. So they did a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled these studies, and they looked at 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different medications, fluoxetine onward. And the results were that the greater the baseline severity, the greater the difference between the placebo and the drug response. So we can see here that when it was really severe depression, we had greater difference between the placebo and the drug response, this green area. But if we look over here where there was a low initial severity, there isn't a whole lot of difference between the placebo and the results. So this is when we talked about when do you treat. If you're thinking about mild depression, you're not using a medication. If you're thinking about severe depression, you know there's going to be more clinical significant difference between placebo and drug response. So this is the proportion of what proportion of major depressions relapse. And it's a little kind of funky looking, but this is from Stephen Stahl. I think, yeah, it's just from his book. But if we look at these two, we're going to look at two different things, but I have to move all these chat boxes here so I can see what's going on. I know what, I'll just look on here. So we can look after the first treatment here, that at the end of 12 months, so this is 12 months, end of 12 months, 33% are still in remission. 60% are not in remission. The relapse rate. So of the people that have received a treatment. So we're not talking about 100%, it just means that the people who have received a first treatment, that there's going to be 33% of them that are in remission. Okay, after 4 treatments, let's look over here, just skip to the bad news, is here at 6 months, we can see that the relapse rate is 70%. By 6 months. So those not in remission, 70%. So basically it wipes out any effect of the treatment after 4 treatments. You can see that there's going to be the same, whether there was remission early on at 3 months or not in remission. It ends up being the same, which is not good. Okay, so even a first antidepressant failure predicts long-term non-response. So this is, if they have this non-response to the first antidepressant, we can expect this sort of odds ratio of treatment failure. Comorbid anxiety disorder has the highest odds ratio of treatment failure. Current suicidal risk and melancholic features also are predicted, but non-response to the first antidepressant received a lifetime has a lower odds ratio. So here's a nice little summary of this. The first, second, third, fourth antidepressant done in terms of how many got well and stayed well. So we can see by the 4th antidepressant, we've got only 4% got well and stayed well. This is the refractory treatment, refractory depression that we see. And this is data from the STAR-D. Factors associated with treatment resistance in major depressive disorder. So recurrent episodes versus single episodes really are still have this lower odds ratio. Here, this comorbid panic disorder predicts a much more likelihood of treatment resistance. Here we have 3 odds ratio here. Okay, I'm seeing something here. When I see the number of steps in the STAR-D, I can see why so many would leave the study. I can barely remember to stick. That's so true. Yes. A lot of people left the study, and a lot of people are going to leave your practice because they just feel hopeless about it. So, I think I'm fading here too. Is the problem? It's like, oh gosh, it's a long day, and it's hot here. It's like 80 degrees where we are. Okay, so have you heard about tachyphylaxis yet? In any other tachyphylaxis? Tachyphylaxis in any of your other classes? Anybody, please? Yes. Okay. So you can see that I'll just talk about it briefly then. But so with antidepressant tachyphylaxis, you can see that basically there's this antidepressant tolerance, poop out or breakthrough depression. And that's when you've had a previous response and it's no longer working. So essentially there's relapse. And it's really distinct from non-response treatment resistant or partial inadequate treatments. It's different. It's basically the antidepressant works, it's not working anymore. So here's, again, that sort of bad news thing, is that the long-term antidepressant treatment may be a factor in development of antidepressant drug tolerance. One theory is it may be due to evolving pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic tolerance from chronic exposure. So if we think about other drugs, there's tolerance in all sorts of drugs. We see tolerance in benzodiazepines, we see tolerance in opiates. And now sort of the information coming out is that there may be tolerance to antidepressants, and that may be one reason that this tachyphylaxis happens. And it's about 25% of those treated. That's not a small number. And here's some more sort of theoretical information. I'm not going to tell you that I know this to be true. It was, again, it's information that's fairly recent stuff. This author here, L. Malachi, I think he's a proponent of it, but was presented at this recent conference about it, and he calls it tardive dysphoria. We had a break already. Didn't we have a break?
Yeah,
we had a break, so we're not getting another break. We did a 15-minute break, so we're probably getting dismissed early anyways, but because I'm fading. But no, not another break. This presentation is almost done. So tardive dysphoria is what he calls it, is a chronic, often treatment-resistant depressive state with onset while on persistent antidepressant treatment. So basically, they're on the antidepressant and they just get depressed. So it's a little bit different than poop out. It's a more dysphoric state. The theory is that this chronic exposure to the antidepressants can produce tolerance, that the depressive state may be perpetuated and worsened by continuing the antidepressant. And that's the part, again, if you're really just getting into prescribing and you see that, it makes you start thinking a little bit differently. And it may be particularly the serotonin reuptake inhibitors that are strongly associated with this. The same author, actually the same presenter, showed some of the data that shows that recovery is actually becoming more rare There was one study that looked at the trajectory of depression in a large group of patients, and saw that now that the recovery rate is only 33% compared to 50% in the 1980s. So his theory is that this sort of tardive dysphoria is what's happening. So this chronic exposure to antidepressants is causing it. So what happens? So what happens if nothing works or it stops working? So you're treating and it suddenly stops working, or you've treated and it never works. You've got to start asking yourself questions. Okay, we got a question here. Could it be that people who are just more excited about antidepressants in the 80s because they were just coming out newer? Anything's possible. As you all know, that correlation is always, sort of a relative thing for some people. And, that's why I presented this as just, it's a theory, because there's always going to be some people that are presenting, fairly far out theories than others. But I think that the data is fairly compelling that, there is some of this sort of tolerance that might be developing. But yeah, could be other things too, who knows. So anyway, so you need to really be thinking about if the patient isn't getting better, what's going on? Are they really taking their medications as like they're supposed to? And the truth is, a lot of them don't. A lot of them sort of mess with it. They forget it. They decide that they don't want to take it, or grandma told them they shouldn't be taking the medication, so they may not be adherent to the medication regime. There's a possibility too that there's a severity of emerging depressive response. So maybe there are things in the environment that are causing more severe response, even though the antidepressant is working. Is there some undisclosed substance abuse or occult medical illness? And you can't rule out the possibility that maybe they didn't come in with a medical illness, but they got it during the course of treatment. I had one patient myself that she was responding well to her antidepressants, and then she wasn't. She was getting more and more depressed. Well, she had undiagnosed cancer, and so there can be something that merges over the course of your treatment with them. You need to ask yourself, did you really get the diagnosis correct? So maybe you missed bipolar disorder potentially. So maybe this is like that sort of maybe sort of missed the hypomanic state that was happened, or the activation that happened from the antidepressant. So maybe it isn't depression. Did you really target the symptoms? Did you choose a medication, or did you use an adjunctive medication that treated the anxiety symptoms, which may be part of the whole overlying presentation? Is it this poop out that's occurred? Is it a treatment-resistant depression? And then there could be this associated sort of placebo response due to other coexisting nonspecific factors, i.e., just other stuff you don't know that's going on. And at the big bottom, I've got or. So this is where, Dr. Papp talked to you a little bit about these new emerging sorts of medications. We're going to talk a lot in the PTSD lectures about these new medications that are coming out and sorts of therapies that go along with medications. You've got to think out of your box that maybe it's beyond what you can treat, thinking about referring out and what other things might be possible for this patient. So we're going to have, now I need to ask, before we dismiss for the day, I need to ask Aiden, please, is if we end early, are we still going to get credit for it, or do I need to assign some sort of homework or something?
Yeah, doctor, absolutely. I'm going to also, with your permission, run the attendance poll right now.
Okay, and so everybody's still going to get their credits if we end a little bit early?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, no so I'm going to ask you, though, to do one thing between today and tomorrow. It's not going to take you more than 15, 20 minutes. I want you to look at the posted papers that we put. You can choose a really short one, but I want you to choose one and just at least look at the look at the abstract of it, some of the results that happened, because there's some, I think for all of you who are looking for innovative sort of treatment, there's something there for you. So choose one of them, and then I want you to please email me or respond tomorrow. I'd prefer it if you email to me just which article you chose. That's all you have to do, okay? All right, any questions? All right, have the rest of a good day if you can.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.